I know.
We're rolling.
We're rolling. Okay. Thank you, Hannah. Welcome, Angela. We're going to talk about Christ cleansing the temple in chapter 9 today. And I'm going to begin by reading John 2:12 through 25. And here's what it says. After this, he, Jesus, went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. All Jewish males were required to go to Jerusalem for the feast. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." I believe that's a prophecy from Zechariah that Jesus is fulfilling here. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." What is that sentence, destroy this temple? What is the subject of that sentence? It is the understood you. So he's telling them, you, Pharisees, you destroy this temple, and I will raise it up. The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" Yeah, right. That's kind of what they say after that. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So they didn't realize all of this until afterward, what was going on, what was meant. They misunderstood it at the time. Pretty much everyone did. And this is a theme in John, this theme of misunderstanding. Now, when he was in Jerusalem, Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness to tell him about people, for he himself knew what was in man. He knew what they were thinking. He knew who they were, what their sins were, all of those things. So let's take a look at this again. We've just studied the miracle at Cana. This happens sometime after that. We don't know exactly how long after that, but I want you to note a couple of things. We read in John 2:12 that after this he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers. Now, Capernaum is, Capernaum is actually north of Cana, or Nazareth, wherever he had been before that. So why would they say he went down?
What did you say?
It says he went down to Capernaum even though he was going north. My daughter, as we speak, is driving to Michigan. I would not say she is going down to Michigan because Michigan is north of here.
Because it's
So
below
what could they
John.
mean? What?
Because it's below Jerusalem. Or actually, which one did you say?
No, it's
Going
north
up
of
to-
Jerusalem
oh, okay.
too.
Elevation.
So they spoke in terms of elevation. They were more likely to speak in terms of elevation in their culture than we are. We speak geographically. We name up and down geographically. They did in terms of elevation. In fact, it's going to say that they went up to Jerusalem, which was south. And it was literally higher in elevation, but that they also always said no matter where you were coming from, you went up to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was the holy city, so honoring Jerusalem. Capernaum is a name that means the village of Nahum. I don't know if it was the village of the prophet Nahum who wrote the book, but that's the meaning of it. And it was to become the earthly headquarters of Jesus. It was where Peter lived with his mother. He didn't live with his mother. I'm not saying he was living in her basement and playing video games. But it was his house, his family's house. Families lived together. Jesus, when he would have time off, we will find he went to Capernaum. He went to Peter's house. That's where he went. And so they stayed there for some undetermined amount of time. Neither Matthew, Mark, nor Luke, none of the synoptic gospels give us information about this first Passover, nor does it give us information about this part of Jesus' life, this point of Jesus' life. But Capernaum, as I said, became his earthly headquarters, where Peter lived. They have excavated Capernaum, and they have found what they believe might have been Peter's house. Based on the coins found on the floor and the writings on the wall, they know at very least it was a place where worship of Jesus was conducted from a very early time period. And it may even be Peter's house.
How do they know?
You want to see it?
Yeah.
I thought you might.
How do they know?
That is a picture of the synagogue in Capernaum. It may very well be the same synagogue Jesus would have gone to. They're not totally sure about that, but it seems to date to Jesus' time. And so this is a synagogue ruins. This is an overview of Capernaum. And you see here the synagogue. You see this kind of whatever 1, 2, however many sides that is. I don't know. Let's call it octagonal. I have no idea. Area, that is the house. That is the place that they think might be Peter's house. Here's a close-up of it. This may have well been where Jesus stood, where Jesus walked. Certainly he was in Capernaum. So certainly he walked here. Anybody want to go to Israel with me yet? Yeah. I would quite literally freak out if I was standing there. I mean, it would just blow me away. He's going to the Passover in this passage. So it's spring. Passover was in the spring. And only John tells us about this particular Passover. Now, the synoptic, all 4 Gospels have a story like this. All 4 Gospels have Jesus cleansing the temple. Here's the problem. John has it early in his ministry, his first Passover. The synoptic Gospels have it at his last Passover, shortly before his crucifixion. So how do we rectify this? How do we make this work? And there's several options. One option would be that somebody got it wrong. Either the synoptics got it wrong or John got it wrong. But if we're talking about Scripture being inerrant, well, that would make it errant, right? It would be error. There's no reason to think that somebody got it wrong. There may have been 2 cleansings. There may have been one at the beginning, and there may have been one at the end. And that is the interpretation that your curriculum takes. I'm going to give you a third possibility. And I don't know which it is, but I'm going to give you a third possibility. The third possibility is this, that it was the same cleansing as in the Synoptic Gospels, and it happened late in Jesus' ministry, but for whatever reason, for his own reasons, maybe thematic ones, John intentionally moved it to the earlier Passover. Now, we, as Greek-minded Americans, have a problem with that. Well, that means it's an error. No, it doesn't. Our education is based on Greek education. It's we think very logically, we think very much in terms of time. If you put something out of order, it's wrong, and you can't do that. That is the way we think. Eastern cultures are not so much that way. They're not as concerned with timing. And a story isn't wrong if it's intentionally placed someplace else for the author's own reasoning. And so John may have had reasons that we're not sure about to place it here. I don't know which it is. I'm fine with either one. And the reason is that if you think like John thought, he's saying this is a true story. It occurred, at a different time, but it's a true story. So they can be brought together. They can be reconciled. And so let's talk about this event of the Passover. Verse 13 of chapter 2 says, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Anybody remember what the purpose of, think back to middle school or elementary school if you were here. What do you know about the Passover? What was the Passover?
Like celebrated the Israelites leaving or going north from control of Egypt.
Yes, it celebrates the release of captivity of the Israelites from Egypt. What else do you know? Nothing. Come on. Somebody knows something.
Blood of the lamb over the doorway.
Okay. And who did that?
The Israelites.
The Israelites did that. Okay. Why?
So like the.
I mean, I'm not going to go paint blood on my door.
So the angel of death would pass over the house.
So the angel, see, you know more than you let on. So the angel of death or God would pass over that house. Why would they need to? Why would you need to pass over that house? What?
The angel of death would have killed the firstborn son.
If you did not have the blood of the lamb over your doorposts, then the firstborn son in that household would die. So the Passover reminds the Israelites of their Egyptian captivity and their release, and it's recorded in Exodus 12. It describes the original Passover. But let's back up a little bit in Exodus. Moses is before the burning bush, and God is speaking from the bush saying, go back to Egypt. And Moses is like, I fled there, I got in trouble, they want to kill me, I'm not sure this is a good plan. And God says, go back to Egypt and free your people. And Moses argues with God. But finally he says, I'm going to be with you, go. And so he does. And he marches up to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh goes, yeah, no, you can't go. So God begins to bring plagues. Do you remember how many there were in all?
10.
There are 10 plagues. See, you know so much more than you let on. There were 10 plagues. The first one was the river, the water in the river, the Nile River, turning to blood. So there was not drinkable water in the Nile, or usable water, because blood is not really usable for much of anything, except for keeping us alive. And then there were gnats, and there were, I don't know, there were flies, and there was darkness, and all kinds of different plagues. And at different times, the Pharaoh would get fed up with this and want it to all go away. So he'd say, okay, your people can go. And then he'd turn around and go, no, sorry, just kidding, psych, yeah, you cannot go, and wouldn't let them go. So God finally brings this 10th and final plague. And the Israelites were told to get each family to get a spotless lamb and to set it aside. And then a number of days later, they were told to kill that lamb and sprinkle its blood on the doorposts, on the side and the top of the doorposts. And then they were commanded to make a special kind of meal. It's called the Seder feast. And this is what they do every Passover. The Jews have this Seder feast. They were to take that lamb that they had killed and that blood that they had put over the doorposts, and they were to roast it and eat it along with unleavened bread and a number of other prescribed items that all recalled their captivity in Egypt. The unleavened bread was to remind them that they had to leave in such a hurry that they did not have time to let their bread rise. They just had to bake it and go. They have this thing called caroset, which is this chopped apples and walnuts and some kind of it's a sweet, kind of a sweet balsamic vinaigrette in it. It's really very delicious, and that was reminiscent of the mortar of the bricks that they had made. Everything had and still does have a purpose. And when they ate that night, they ate in their traveling clothes. They had to be ready to go when Pharaoh said go. But why is it called the Passover? Well, as we said, the angel of death, or God, passed over. The Lord passed through the whole nation and killed the firstborn son of every household that did not have the lamb's blood. So those who had the lamb's blood, they were saved by the blood of the lamb. Any connections to the New Testament? Yeah, there's a lot of them. Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what if there's no male children in the house? Would the father die?
Not unless he was the firstborn child, but if he was the firstborn child, he would as well.
So he would have to
Would the
put the blood
firstborn-
for himself.
Like if the father was the firstborn child and his son was the firstborn?
I think they both would
die.
die. I think
Oh, wow.
so.
So then
I
would he
think
put
so.
the blood on top of the thing if his parents weren't alive to do it? Does it matter who does it? As long
Well,
as
it
the
was
household-
only Israelites that did it, so.
Yeah, so like
Wait,
like the
Did
father.
Pharaoh have an older brother then?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, he did.
Who that brother?
Yes.
Do you think there are any Israelites who didn't put the blood on their door?
I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us that I know of.
Did
It's
somebody
ridiculously stupid not to, but maybe. So the Lord passed through and left unharmed those who had the blood of the Lamb on their doorposts. Let's see what we've got going here. The Passover, reminder to remind the Israelites of their Egyptian captivity and release. It was to be an annual event. Okay. So it was to be an annual event, and in Exodus, where it is commanded for the Jews, God says, you are to do this every year forever. And indeed, they still do celebrate this every year. So on the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar, which is the month of Nisan, they celebrate this Passover to this day. The evening after Passover became the first night of a second holy day, a second festival or feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It also was looking back on the Passover and God's provision and the fact that they had to leave so quickly that they ate unleavened bread. For those 7 days, they could not eat anything with leaven in it. In fact, they were supposed to scour their houses, including sweeping everything on the floor out of the house, to make sure that there was no yeast, there was no leaven anywhere in the household. Now, in the Bible, you've got Passover, and then at the end of Passover, which is sundown on that day, the Feast of Leavened Bread begins. So the whole thing is seamless. That 8 days is seamless. It goes on for 8 days. In Jesus' day, that whole 8 days was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The whole thing was. Modern day Jews call the whole thing the Passover. But either way, there are two separate feasts that are celebrated consecutively. But we have in verse 13, we have John calling it the Jews' Passover. But in Exodus 12, where it is initiated, it is called the Lord's Passover. Is this incidental? Maybe. Is it intentional? Maybe. But what theological point might John be making by calling it the Jews' Passover instead of the Lord's Passover? Yeah. Oh, you're going to say something? Oh, you're just moving your arm. Okay.
Maybe that the Jews are like chosen specifically.
Maybe.
We no longer have a need for a Passover?
Well, I think that's closer. I think that as we've seen and as we'll see in this story that we're about to talk about, the whole thing had degenerated. The whole thing, think of what Christmas has become, right? Is it really about a baby being born to save the world? For some people. But for our culture, it's about gifts and trees and a guy in a red suit. It's not about that. It's degenerated. That had happened here for the Passover. The Passover that had been focused on the Lord. It is the Lord's Passover. He is the one who saved us, or saved the Jews. Now it's the Jews' Passover. They didn't pass over. They didn't save themselves. I think that may be a point that he's making, that John's making here. And we're going to see in this story this commercialism. Now, every person had to bring a lamb to sacrifice. Not every person, every family had to bring a lamb to sacrifice, or had to bring a sacrifice for Passover. If they could afford a lamb, it was a lamb. And they also had to bring money to pay the temple tax, which was paid at about that time. If they lived far away, they probably only had Roman coins, and they needed Hebrew shekels to pay the tax. And it would be very inconvenient to drag a lamb all the way there with you. And so this practice of providing that in Jerusalem was very convenient for these people. It's kind of like Thanksgiving for my family. My entire side of the family meets in Kansas City for Thanksgiving, and I make some pies and take them down, and I make on Thanksgiving morning I make pumpkin pancakes and from scratch. They're delicious, and I make them make shapes. They tell me what shape they want, and I make the shape. I'm not very good at that part, but they're very kind to me and saying, sure, that looks like a backwards Nebraska, because I always forget that when you flip it over, it's facing the opposite direction. And it really probably doesn't look like a backwards Nebraska. But I have a sister coming from Orlando and a sister coming from Texas, and one of my sisters lives in Kansas City, in Overland Park. We do not bring all the food that we need from these far places. We wait till we get there and we go shopping together. It's a lot of fun. And we split the bill for all the food that we need. That's what makes sense. And so in some sense, this was providing a service for those who were coming from far away, because remember, it was required for Jewish males to be at the feast. So that's how the practice arose, to sell the animals and to exchange the money for people coming from a long ways away. Originally, this is a drawing of the Temple Mount. Originally, those shops were outside the temple, around the wall, and in the streets close to the temple. But over time, it moved into this big court of the Gentiles. When it talks about the temple, it means this whole thing. The temple was this whole thing. This is the place with the holy place and the most holy place. But the Temple Mount was referred to, the whole thing was referred to as the temple. Over time, it moved from outside the temple into the inside of the temple. Not only that, but you had people charging exorbitant amounts of money. That because of the need, prices were artificially inflated. We're going to go take my granddaughter to Frozen when it comes out, Frozen 2 when it comes out. I hope she doesn't freak out. I hope it's not scary for a 2.5-year-old. She loves Frozen, loves. Last time she was over, she and Katie were upstairs just singing at the top of their lungs, singing all the Frozen songs up in Katie's bedroom. But if we want to go at 6 o'clock on Saturday night, we're going to pay more than if we go at 2 o'clock on Thursday, right, or on Wednesday. Why? Because that's when everyone wants to go. That's when they make their money. They're trying to entice people to come at those other times, so they lower the prices. This is common practice, but it's happening in the place that the Lord dwells. You also have these money changers, and they were gouging people with their interest. If you go to a foreign country, the very worst place that you can exchange money is in the airport, but it's the most convenient place. You should wait until you get into a town and go to a money changer there. Now, when I go to Zambia, let's say I'm exchanging 20 American dollars for kwacha, that's their exchange. If I do that in the airport, I may get $15 for my $20, because that's how they make their money. If I go into town in Lusaka, I'll probably get $18 for my $20. They're gouging you because of the convenience, and that's what happens. But it's happening in the Lord's dwelling place. And so that is the problem. Here, I want to give you a word picture here and see if this helps you. Imagine a church. Any of y'all do Black Friday? I've done Black Friday. Black Friday is the day after Thanksgiving, and it's awful. We sell a bunch of stuff for Christmas. It's just this horrible, it's just awful. But I have done Black Friday. In fact, I used to do Black Friday a lot, and it was like a sport to me. Like I had a plan. I had tactics that I would use. I had this map that said, okay, we're going to here, and then we're going to here, and this is what we're getting here, and this, and I was the leader. I was the driver. I was the leader of all of us doing it. Then they started opening the stores on Thanksgiving, and it ruined the whole thing for me. I am not going shopping on Thanksgiving. I'm not going to do that. So imagine a church that decides, great way to make money. We'll make a ton of money. We'll buy all of these half-priced goods that everybody wants on sale. And then we'll open up the sanctuary on Black Friday. And what would you think if you opened up the Black Friday ads and here's some church in Omaha that's opening a Black Friday market in their sanctuary? Do you think some people might have a problem with that? Yeah. And this is even worse than that idea, that they're doing all of this in the very dwelling place of God. So we're going to stop there for today. We'll pick up here on Monday and hopefully finish the lecture.